Hi guys, Paul here. Welcome back to the Anfield View. Yes, on this incredibly hot, very hot, hence the blind being down. Friday afternoon, Michael Edwards in charge sort of the sporting footballing side for FSG, more so than Liverpool these days. He's left his role with FSG, which essentially means he's obviously left the role with Liverpool as well. Unless we have some miraculous miracle that he's going to somehow sort of take over from Richard Hughes, which well, I'd be staggered if that was the case. I think this is him leaving the whole group ultimately, because if he wanted to come back as sporting director for Liverpool, he invariably would have been, would have taken that opportunity. And he only came back really in the stipulation of a much wider and a much bigger role for the FSG as a whole. And he was charged very much to come on board and to really lead that sort of multi-club model and really explore FSG purchasing other football clubs, along those avenues. We all know about this. That's never really materialized for a multitude of reasons. And am I shocked? In some ways, it's not great timing, but equally, it was pretty widely known that both Edwards and Hughes were going to be leaving. Their contracts were up next year anyway. It was pretty obvious to everybody that they were leaving at that point, if not earlier. We've already heard that pretty much on the grapevine that Richard Hughes is probably leaving in September. Look, he may well stand for a little bit longer, but it's been put out there, that he probably will be leaving around September, October. He's going to take a job in Saudi, and so where does that leave Liverpool? Oh, as far as I know, Mike Gordon is really stepping into the role to really replace Michael Edwards. Where does it leave us from a sporting director? I'm not entirely sure. I mean, from what I understand, it could well be somebody stepping up, from below. It's just a bit of a mess, isn't it? Frankly, I mean, ultimately, you got Richard Hughes leaving after a couple of seasons. Well, he's been given his biggest opportunity in football, and then he's only there 2 years, and then he's leaving, which is a bit bizarre in its own right. And then you got Michael Edwards coming back to obviously with one objective. And I suppose if you want to put it in a simplistic point of view, he came back to really do one thing. And fundamentally, that's not happened. And so maybe from both parties' perspective, they just decided, well, you know, all the best with your next opportunities type scenario. Because I suppose if they're not going to go down that avenue, and he doesn't really want to become too attached to the transfer scenarios that are ongoing, or the lack of transfer scenarios, and doesn't really want to have any involvement with that aspect. Obviously, I think it was pretty instrumental in bringing Hughes in for us as well. So maybe there's been a bit of tension. I can only speculate, as I say, it's only my opinion, it's not fact. I can only expect maybe there is a little bit of tension, between Hughes, Slot, Michael Edwards. All three of those scenarios, they all would have been under stress and strain after the last 12 months. And obviously, Slot had to go, which obviously was Hughes's appointment. Edwards was very much instrumental in bringing Hughes on board as well. And so it's one of those that I suppose everyone has questions, and everyone comes under the microscope when things aren't going well. So am I surprised it's happened today? Sure. Would have been pretty better if it happened in September, October? Possibly. As I say, he's quit his role at FSG. How much he was really involved in transfers, we really don't know unless we're part of the day-to-day operation. Is Richard Hughes been sort of, phoning up Mike Edwards for assistance and things? We'll never know. Ultimately, I mean, you would think logic would suggest you would tap into that resource, if you were Richard Hughes, and obviously with that resource no longer there, that just heaps even more pressure on Richard Hughes for these next 2 months. I mean, what worries me the most is that it's hardly been a rapid transfer window for us already, and now with the experience of Edwards not being there, and I don't want to put blame on Hughes or anything. We're still early in this window, and a lot can still be done. But ultimately, it's never, losing somebody of that experience that you can lean on, in these, I wouldn't say turbulent times, but the club is in a transitional moment. And we really do need to make crucial buys and crucial decisions. And it feels like a lot of instability. Losing him from the overall group is not really it can't be a good thing because of his track record and his experience. You then obviously have the situation where Slots had to go as well. We lost Peter Moore, obviously, a few years ago, and Peter Moore was very much integral to a lot of the stability that we had. So for a long time, we had Jurgen Klopp, Peter Moore, and Michael Edwards always there. Then you had Julian underneath them as well. And so it feels like a merry-go-round of everybody leaving. If it isn't the players leaving, it's the management leaving. In the last, for 3 or 4 years, it's just been a merry-go-round of everybody leaving. Just when you really need maximum stability. Not in the manager's case, it was a situation where you just can't excuse the season that went by. And so I'm okay with that element, but you really don't want massive figureheads really above leaving. I'm sure, if we were in a situation at the end of this season where this transfer window didn't go well and we didn't have a great season, then yes, you would be like, okay, maybe you'd part ways with Richard Hughes on mutual terms. It hasn't worked out and you get somebody hopefully better. But the fact that coming up to September, Hughes could be gone, Edwards could be gone. We're then with no sporting director, no senior person that was the previous sporting director there either. And boy, it's one of these weird scenarios that we almost could do with Peter Moore coming back and Billy Hogan sort of having more of an influence over those elements, even though that's not his role. He's the CEO. But it's a bit like we need to almost get some of the old established crew back into the club to really get this sort of foundation and footing back again. Obviously, look, you're not going to get Klopp back. I get that, and we're all supportive of Iriola, but Jesus, it's not giving Iriola the greatest chance when the people that he's relying on to give him the squad that he needs to achieve things. When it looks like Hughes is leaving next in September. As I say, look, he may well be here, and I'm to the end of the season, but his contract runs out then regardless. I don't see a world where Hughes is staying. It's pretty much widely known that he is going to Saudi in sort of September, October. And if he decides to say, fantastic, but we're in a situation now where Edwards has officially left FSG. And so barring some miracle situation where he's left FSG to then come back as sporting director and Hughes has then gone to Saudi, we'd all be loving that. That really would be breaking news. That'd be breaking news of a good situation. I'd love to have Michael Edwards back as a sporting director, but I'd be stunned if he's decided to, he only came back on the proviso of doing one thing and he quit, the sporting director role in the first place. And so would love him to come back as sporting director. I don't know how I don't know whether he would ever contemplate doing it or who knows would be the situation. Is there a miracle Hail Mary pass out there where FSG have spoken to Michael Edwards and said, look, Richard Hughes is leaving, relatively soon. Are you open to coming back as sporting director? I just think that's a 1% chance. It's more likely that we promote somebody up from within. That has pretty much been doing a lot of, not a lot of the groundwork, but been working alongside Richard Hughes. Quite like when you see a lot of players being introduced after they've signed. There's been people that have been very much alongside Richard Hughes that could well be promoted into that sporting director role. So where does it leave the club? It's just more instability. Look, ultimately he is fundamentally leaving FSG from the FSG role, then leaving a role specifically at Liverpool. This isn't him leaving as sporting director like before, but I always felt a little bit of a crumb of comfort. I don't know what about you guys, by the fact that having Edwards there, you always felt that, do you know what, if Richard Hughes needed to lean on somebody for experience, for a contact or how to negotiate a certain deal, these different elements, because of his vast experience dealing at our club size, then you always had Michael Edwards on hand to help him. And so with him not being there, it does sort of it makes me a little bit twitchy in that respect. In terms of, I'm already a little bit anxious in terms of I don't feel we've really moved that quickly or that urgent in this window already. I know people will say, well, we've signed two people. Well, one of them was purchased in January, and one of them was on a release clause. So we haven't had to negotiate. And it was what, a £35 million deal, and I'm looking forward to Muniz. I really am. But we're in a little bit of a weird cycle at the moment. The only players we seem to be going after are ones that have release clauses, which, but ultimately that's not really the. It's good to find ones with release clauses that turn into superstars, but it's not really the art of negotiation, just meeting a release clause. The art of negotiation is being able to win deals when everyone else is competing against yourself, as well. And that's really the true test of how good you are at negotiating. And so being able to negotiate somebody who's already got a release clause, well, you're not having to negotiate with the club because the fee's already set. So you really only have to win over the player on that side. So we're very weird times and weird dynamics. I wouldn't say turbulent, maybe a bit strong. I would say unsettling. I just feel that it was a good person, a very experienced and somebody with great expertise to have at hand should Richard Hughes need it, and he's no longer there. Of course, I'm pretty sure Michael Edwards would be kind enough to take a call if Richard Hughes really didn't need a conversation with him. But equally, yeah, am I surprised? In long term, no. I expected them both gone at the end of next season. Um, but equally, was I expecting it right this minute? No. So it's either happened because FSG have just decided, well, we're not doing the multi-model. I've asked him to do maybe another role and he doesn't want to do that, or he's got an opportunity elsewhere, maybe a club in Saudi, maybe the same club as Richard Hughes wants to go to in Saudi, maybe somewhere, who knows on that front, mate. I'm sure it's probably a grand role that he's being offered. But yeah, that's the breaking news, guys. Wanted to sort of jump on and really update you on that front. Michael Edwards has left FSG, as really being their chief footballing director. Really was brought back, and also agreed to come back. Really, to really spearhead the multi-club model, which is really looking at FSG sort of purchasing other clubs, a bit like what the City Group model essentially is. Didn't really materialise, and sort of I suppose he's been stuck in an element of limbo since, with that not really happening. So long term, not necessarily a huge surprise. I suppose there was always a little part of me that would have loved him to come back as sporting director, but he didn't want to come back in that proviso before, and he left it before after doing it for ages. So who knows? One can hope, can't they, on that front? And in terms of where does that leave Richard Hughes? With a whole heap of pressure on his own at the moment, but Mike Gordon's stepping in to take over really the role of really what Michael Edwards was doing. Yeah, the club really feels like it's having a bit of a brain drain of really crucial people in a lot of years. Obviously, we lost the stability of Klopp for years, then we lost Peter Moore for years, and Billy Hogan's an absolute genius in terms of the management of the club and the commercial side of the club. But obviously, I always, you can only wear so many hats, and obviously you also rely on other people underneath you to also be there and reliable and fantastic as well. And there's loads of fantastic people at Liverpool, but it's just one of those. In recent times we've had quite a mass exodus of a lot of key people leaving, whether it's scouts, whether it's fitness people, whether it's like you say, whether it's sporting directors, whether it's managers. Loads of key players walking on free contracts. It's do need a period of stability would be wonderful. I mean, I'm not even chasing dreams of Premier Leagues over the next couple of years. It'd be nice to be competitive and frankly just stable. And we've gone from ultimate 10 years of stability to a lot of instability post sort of the Peter Moore Klopp era. And so yeah, it'd be great to hear what your thoughts are, guys. Look, ultimately, always a great deal of respect for what Edwards did during the Klopp era. And yes, Klopp also turned those diamonds in those buys into absolute diamonds. We get it. It took two. Look, Edwards, I know, have some gems. The scouting was amazing. So we had great scouting. We moved. We were probably one of Edwards' greatest sort of attributes for the football inside of Liverpool was the fact that he was a genius at sales, an absolute genius at sales. He would get great fees for sales. In terms of the buys, look, so some of the buys we've got on like Matip and Andy Robertson and all these different people and Wijnaldum, it's a combination of scouting. Yes, he brought them in, but they weren't for huge fees. It's not necessarily a great negotiation. And Klopp turned them into absolute diamonds with obviously key part in the player. And so I would say Michael Edwards' main strength is really not so much the purchases per se, because the ones that we did spend a lot of money on, we mainly came out of a massive pot from Coutinho. But I would say his genius really falls more on the sales side of Liverpool. He would sell, sort of youth players for 20 million. He'd be selling average players for 30 million. He'd be selling Coutinho for 140 million. So he was an absolute genius at sales. I always say that, for himself, and the combination of Klopp, scouting, and him were the oracle that worked in terms of the buys. He moves on. Where to? I'm sure there won't be a shortage of offers. I'm sure there's probably 1,001 offers for himself. There was when he wasn't working after Liverpool. There's 1,001 people that were after him, and I'm sure there will be again on that front. Look, ultimately, I'd love to have him back as sporting director, but maybe that ship has forever sailed. I don't know. I mean, ultimately, that element really depends on whether he ever wants to go back to being a sporting director. But all of the I suppose all of the actual momentum and everything that's come out of the last 3, 4, 5 years is he sort of looking to go upwards and upwards and upwards. I wouldn't be surprised if he ended up as being in the CEO position in 5 years. And so it's one of those situations where is he likely to come back down to being a sporting director? I don't look at it as coming down. I look at it as it's complete. Being a sporting director and being a manager of football, of a football club is a completely different role to being a CEO. There's not an up and down. Ultimately, they're all crucial. If you haven't got a great manager, you're not going to have a great team. You're not going to win anything, which jeopardises everybody at the football club. If you don't have a good sporting director, that jeopardises the manager. And if you don't have a good CEO, jeopardises the whole thing. So, like, all vitally important. So, look, for all I know, he may have his eyes on being a CEO at some point. I don't know him personally, so I would never know. It's only my opinion. But from what I see, he's very ambitious. And so maybe he's got his role of a very senior role in maybe a club in Dubai or Saudi or elsewhere, and he wants to do that. Maybe, you never know. But that's my update, guys. Michael Edwards has left FSG in his sporting role, where he's really overseeing the multi club model, and never really sort of materialised. I mean, it wasn't because he wasn't working on it; it just didn't materialise in terms of purchasing another club, which was really what he was, I suppose, brought in to do to some extent for the FSG group, more than obviously Liverpool part of that group, but in terms of really how it affects Liverpool, as I said before, it's really a question of it was a bit of, I suppose, a crumb of comfort to know that he was there should Hughes need to lean on his experience or contacts or advice. And so he's not there. Hopefully he can still lean on that, and we move on, isn't it? Yeah, one more thing we need to try and sort out, but this is an FSG thing. Mike Gordon has already moved aside, to really overtake what he was working on, and so it doesn't really impact Liverpool that much, apart from just a little bit more instability. Plus, I suppose the question is who would be in charge of replacing Richard Hughes. And I suppose that is the question, isn't it? Has he left because he wants to keep Richard Hughes, or is he leaving because Hughes is leaving, or is he leaving because he just is it come to the end of what he came to do, or are they both leaving because they're going to the same sort of new project? Ultimately, as Johnny Ball once said, Johnny Ball will reveal all. Look, time will tell. We could be sitting here in September. They both could be at the same club in Saudi, and it becomes very obvious what's happened. Or we could be sitting here and he's CEO of another football club and he's just gone for essentially a promotion. But we will find out, isn't it? I think, look, ultimately, people just in the actual club side, Liverpool side, which is they've always said Liverpool has to run themselves for themselves, and whilst FSG are there to support Liverpool does is a self-sufficient model, and so really, look, Richard Hughes, he's obviously there. He's been employed for a reason, for his expertise, and so let's see it come to the fore now, and hopefully he will have obviously the support around him to really help him achieve what he needs to achieve in the next 2 months to leave us in a good shape. And we move from there, isn't it, really, guys? So let me know what your thoughts are, and I look forward to speaking to you more soon. Take care.